So when I graduated high school, I was 17 years old. I enlisted in the Army the next week just to get out of that.
A frozen battlefield, a handful of young soldiers, and a camera that clicked at the worst of times. Among them stood 19-year-old Francis Sherman Currey, quiet, ordinary, or so it seemed. 80 years later, historians zoomed in on that same photo and fell silent. Something hidden in plain sight unsettled them, a detail that explained why hardened enemies once hesitated before him. What could a single image reveal after so many decades? Why did it leave experts pale when they finally saw it? Winter fire, quiet kid. Francis Sherman Currey's story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in obscurity, in upstate New York, where he was born. He never had the secure childhood of many of his peers. By age 12, both of his parents were gone, and he was placed in a foster home in Hurleyville. The Depression-era years taught him self-reliance and quiet resilience, but nothing about his life suggested he was destined for the kind of fame that comes with the Medal of Honor. There were no military legacies in his family, no polished academy background. He was just a small-town boy, one among millions who would be swept into the vortex of World War II. When Currey graduated from high school at 17, he had a choice: stay in that small town or enlist and take his chances in the war that was pulling in every able-bodied young man. He didn't hesitate.
From World War II, lives here in the capital region. He is Sergeant Francis Currey of Selkirk, and he was awarded the medal.
Within a week of receiving his diploma, he was in uniform. He admitted years later that part of his motivation was simply to get out of the town he felt confined in. Yet, whether he knew it or not, this decision put him on a path that would make his name echo in American military history. Army life in 1943 and 1944 was brutal in its speed. The United States needed replacements constantly. Training bases in the States put recruits through crash courses, rifle marksmanship, field tactics, anti-tank weapons, and machine gun crew drills. Many soldiers struggled to keep up, especially with the technical aspects of weapons like the bazooka or Browning automatic rifle. Currey, however, absorbed the material like a sponge.
So in the course of the afternoon, I managed to disable them 3 tanks with a grenade. Then I used the machine gun to cover the last couple of guys.
Instructors noted how quickly he picked up details, remembered procedures, and stayed calm under pressure. Those traits would matter far more than sheer size or bravado when he found himself under fire. By September 1944, Currey was sent to Europe as a replacement infantryman, 30th Infantry Division. Nicknamed Old Hickory after President Andrew Jackson, the division had already carved out a fearsome reputation. It had stormed through Normandy, endured counterattacks in the Netherlands, and was hardened by months of tough, close fighting. For a 19-year-old replacement, arriving in such a unit could have been intimidating. These were combat veterans who had already seen some of the ugliest battles of the European theater. Currey did not try to impress anyone by talking. He just went to work and did what he was told. He bore the burden with no complaints. He made no mistakes that would endanger anyone. To his comrades, he might have seemed steady, even unremarkable, but that steadiness was worth its weight in gold during war. Nobody knew him in December of 1944 and thought, here was a man who would stop tanks. He was just another GI in the never-ending line of foxholes. December 16, 1944, was the day the quiet Ardennes sector exploded into chaos. Adolf Hitler had launched his last gamble in the West, the Ardennes offensive, forever remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. Some 200,000 German troops, with the support of nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, slammed into the American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. The winter was terribly cold, with fog and snow preventing Allied aircraft from operating. The Germans achieved total surprise. What the frontline American units, all too many of which were either green or resting now, had not seen coming was an artillery barrage and the sudden onslaught of armor cutting every possible route for reinforcements into the area. A soldier in Currey's situation had stark choices: hold position, or fade away in the tide. He was 19 years old, an orphan turned soldier, standing now in the way of the most dreaded troops of the war, the Waffen-SS. To picture what comes next means to consider this contrast. On the one hand, there were seasoned SS panzer grenadiers and tanks, notorious slayers carrying the legacy of atrocities from Russia to Malmedy. On the other side stood the quiet kid from New York, who had never fired a shot of his own just weeks before. The war would soon pit industrial might, ideology, and terror against raw courage and adaptability. And Francis Sherman Currey, the very quiet kid, was about to explode. Little did the SS know, the factory bridge ahead of them wasn't defended by a squad or a platoon. It was about to be defended by one private. Hold this bridge or else. By December 20th, 1944, the Ardennes was no longer the quiet, safe sector American commanders once believed it to be. The German counteroffensive had driven a wedge into Allied lines, creating panic and confusion. Towns fell in hours. Communications collapsed. For men on the ground, rumors traveled faster than orders. Whispers of massacres at Malmedy, stories of tanks pushing through roads that experts had insisted were impassable. Soldiers knew what it meant. Capture no longer guaranteed survival. The small Belgian town of Malmedy suddenly became vital ground. Road junctions converged there, channels through which reinforcements and supplies flowed. If German armor seized those crossings, the defense would unravel even faster. The 30th Infantry Division, already tested in Normandy and Holland, was ordered to hold the line. Among its positions, one stood out, a modest bridge on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a famous bridge, not one built of stone arches or ironwork. It was just a crossing in the snow, its frozen planks and steel supports leading into the heart of Malmedy. But in military terms, it was everything. A single armored column breaking across would open the way to deeper penetration, cutting off American units behind. To lose it would mean ceding the town, perhaps even the sector. Into this crucible stepped Private Francis Sherman Currey, 19 years old, carrying the rank of a replacement, not an officer or even a sergeant. Yet his orders were clear enough: hold the bridge. Behind him were other infantrymen, machine gun crews, and scattered anti-tank defenses. But the previous days had been brutal. Anti-tank guns were destroyed. Ammunition was dwindling. Men were exhausted. The line was fragile, and everyone knew it. By the dawn of December 21st, the Germans arrived, first with artillery, screaming shells tearing into the earth, exploding against frozen ground, then showering foxholes with ice and mud shards. Veterans could instantly read the meaning. Heavy shelling was no poker, anything. It was for bringing tanks that would ultimately roll forward once churned ground had pinned men down. He spotted them through the smoke and haze, first shadows and then unmistakable hulks of steel emerging from the fog. German tanks, not one or two, an entire spearhead, moving bumper to bumper across ground, which textbooks had declared unsuitable for armor. The impossible was happening before his very eyes. Most men would have embraced the ground at that moment, prayed for reinforcements, or prepared to retreat. But Currey did something else. He didn't panic. He didn't wait. He took the initiative, spying the silhouette of a tank commander exposed in his turret, and raised his Browning automatic rifle. A burst of fire, deliberate and precise, and the commander slumped out of sight. It did not stop the tank, but it was a message to the Waffen-SS. The bridge would not be theirs without a fight. The Germans were still advancing anyhow. The machine guns swept the road. The infantry followed behind the tanks, sheltered by their armor. The defense, in Currey's opinion, could not delay. If those tanks crossed, Malmedy would fall. He ran over to a barn nearby, where a bazooka was kept. With a little help from another soldier, loading the bazooka while under fire, he shouldered it and fired it straight at the tank lumbering toward him. The rocket whooshed out and smashed into the tank. Smoke poured out of its hull. It groaned, shook, and started to withdraw. One tank stopped. Others kept moving forward. For most defenders, that moment would have marked a terrible disaster. But for Currey, That moment was only the beginning of what he would later on very simply call doing what needed to be done. The orders were simple. Hold this bridge. How he held it was going to be anything but simple. And as the next wave of German armor approached, Currey made a decision that would change not only the battle for Malmedy, but his place in history. One private, many roles. The German push at the bridge should have been unstoppable. They had the numbers, the armor, the weight of artillery behind them. Francis Currey had only a handful of weapons at his disposal. But what set him apart wasn't what he carried. It was how he adapted. In a single morning, he shifted from role to role with a speed and precision that created the illusion of an entire unit. After knocking out the first tank with the bazooka, Currey didn't pause to celebrate. He moved immediately, scanning the battlefield like a chess player already preparing the next move. German infantry was pouring in behind their armor, rifles and machine guns firing in bursts meant to pin the Americans down. Holding one position for too long was a death sentence, so Currey ran. He crossed open ground under fire, diving for cover, hunting for anything he could turn into a weapon. That's when he found the abandoned anti-tank position. Scattered crates, wreckage, and crucially, grenades. Crawling through mud and snow, he gathered them up. Most men would have clutched their rifle and prayed. Currey sprinted forward, closing the gap on the advancing tanks with grenades in hand. At point-blank range, he hurled the first one, striking close to a tank's tracks. The vehicle lurched to a halt. The second explosion rattled another crew so badly that they pulled back. A third crippled yet another tank, forcing its crew to bail out entirely. Each step was calculated chaos. One moment, he was a bazooka gunner. The next, he was an anti-tank grenadier. And then, seconds later, something else altogether. Because while he was halting tanks, Currey also spotted movement. A handful of wounded Americans trapped near a wrecked half-track, pinned by machine gun fire. To reach them meant crossing a bullet-swept road. He didn't hesitate. He crawled, scrambled, and dragged each man one by one to safety, all while shells burst nearby. In that instant, he was not just a fighter. He was a medic, refusing to leave his fellow soldiers behind. Most men would retreat now that they were safe, but Currey was already thinking about the next role. Up went Currey onto the wrecked half-track, seizing the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the vehicle and laying down a tremendous fire into the German battalions. The heavy weapon boomed rounds into the German infantry, scurrying for cover behind their tanks. High-precision fire pinned them down, broke their cohesion, and bought precious time for the Americans. Currey was no longer merely defending, but was now commanding the battlefield. When the machine gun jammed after being preheated, he wasted no time. He picked the Browning automatic rifle and continued to fire smooth, methodical bursts that kept his enemy guessing about just how many defenders they were really facing. For the Waffen-SS, it didn't look like the work of a private. It looked like a coordinated ambush, a full team working in concert. It was impossible to judge psychologically what Currey was doing. The soldiers expect certain attitudes from their opponents. The defenders are pinned, retreated, or awaiting backup. But Currey shattered those expectations. He moved aggressively and unpredictably, used different weapons and tactics so fluid that the Germans were convinced they had stumbled into something much larger. In reality, it was one 19-year-old boy from New York. And even that was not all. He raided other weapons, collecting more Panzerfausts, the single-shot German anti-tank launchers left by retreating infantry. Now, his quiet workmanship was being turned against the owner of that craft, the enemy. Stalking forward, he fired with unnerving accuracy, forcing tank crews to abandon their vehicles rather than risk destruction. Within minutes, one soldier raised the entire thrust of the SS. His comrades were now awestruck. What stared them in the eyes was not random behavior. It was steady ferocity. A young privy taking on every character that a battlefield demanded. Rifleman, grenadier, medic, machine gunner, anti-tank hunter, and every time, he made it through. For the Germans, the confusion spread. Who was this soldier? and how many more like him were hidden in the fog, making an army out of one. On paper, the bridge at Malmedy should have been lost by mid-morning. The Germans had tanks, artillery, and seasoned Waffen-SS infantry pressing forward in coordinated waves. The Americans had a thin line of defenders, scattered weapons, and little chance of reinforcement. Yet hour after hour, the advance faltered, not because of a regiment or a squad, but because of one 19-year-old private who refused to act like a single soldier. Francis Currey was not just fighting, he was multiplying himself. Each time he shifted positions, swapped weapons, or launched an attack from an unexpected angle, he left the enemy guessing. From their perspective, the battlefield was alive with threats. Bazooka rounds from one side, grenades from another, a .50 caliber hammering from high ground, bursts of rifle fire from cover. In reality, every one of those attacks traced back to the same man. The effect was psychological. At Malmedy, just days earlier, they had slain surrendering Americans in a field, sending a chilling message. Resistance was futile. But now, on this bridge, the roles are reversed. Instead of charging with confidence, German infantry began hesitating. Instead of pressing tanks forward, crews paused, unsure whether another hidden bazooka or scavenged Panzerfaust was waiting. The brutality that had cowed so many no longer mattered in the face of one private's relentless defiance. As if conjured from thin air, it was to Currey's fellow soldiers. Men pinned behind broken walls could hear him firing, see tanks withdrawing, and suddenly believe that the line might hold. His moves didn't stall the enemy, they stiffened the backbone of everyone around him. Leadership didn't come from a rank that day. Instead, it came purely from example. Most astonishing of all to the Germans, though, was his calm. It was as fixed as a timetable. Whenever he sprayed to cover certain places, it was done precisely. He never spent an eternity at a point under cover. He moved, advanced, attacked, and on. Outside, it was a coordinated visual that made it look as if there were full squads leapfrogging positions with carefully rehearsed defense. That illusion sent the German commanders second-guessing their next moves. Is this much smaller American detachment really? Were they instead walking into an ambush? Time was the ally of doubt. Time for the injured to pull back. Time to regroup the defense. Time to ready the rest of the 30th Infantry Division for the next German attack. Minutes count more than men in war, and Francis Currey willed those minutes into being. The hardware, the bazookas, grenades, and the machine gun are what anyone might focus on decades after the fact. But these were just tools. What swung the scale at the bridge was his use of them to create the perception of strength when little existed. One soldier became many in the eyes of his enemy. One teenager caused an armored division to hesitate. Even the Germans admitted later. Captured prisoners talked of heavy resistance at Malmedy. They described anti-tank teams in succession, overlapping fires, and coordinated ambushes, never real though. What they really faced was Francis Sherman Currey hustling through snow and smoke, turning every piece of wreckage into a weapon, and every weapon into a reason for retreat. The bridge ought to have been theirs. Instead, it remained in American hands, not because of numbers, but over one man's making himself look like an army. And what came next would turn this impossible stand into a Medal of Honor legend. Citation, medals, and a shrug. When the smoke cleared at Malmedy, Francis Sherman Currey was still standing, and the bridge was still in American hands. For the men who had witnessed it, the memory etched itself into their minds. A 19-year-old private who had stopped German armor, rescued the wounded, and turned a rout into resistance. But the military is not built on memories alone. Deeds are recorded, written, and judged. And in Currey's case, the official record would struggle to capture the scale of what had happened. In early 1945, his company commander submitted the paperwork. The language was formal, even dry, describing how Private Currey assumed an aggressive defense, how he disabled enemy tanks with a rocket launcher, and how he rescued 5 wounded men under heavy fire. The phrases read like a report, but behind them was chaos, fear, and a lone teenager facing down the Waffen-SS. Still, the Army's language had to be restrained, procedural. Courage was compressed into bullet points. The chain of command did not hesitate. Recommendations moved quickly upward, endorsed by officers who recognized that what Currey had done wasn't just brave, it was decisive. Without his actions, the bridge would have fallen. Without the bridge, the defense of Malmedy might have collapsed. That ripple effect made one private's stand a matter of strategic significance. By summer 1945, as Europe celebrated Germany's surrender, Currey was ordered to France. On July 27th, in the town of Reims, Major General Leland Hobbs, commander of the 30th Infantry Division, personally presented him with the Medal of Honor. Just 19 when he fought at Malmedy, Currey was still only 20 when he stood at attention to receive the nation's highest award for valor. The citation for his actions read as follows: knocking out tanks, rescuing comrades, and manning abandoned weapons. To an outsider, it sounded rather unbelievable. To those who were there, however, it was hardly adequate at all. How do you write down how one soldier transformed the morale of everyone around him? How, for instance, do you write down the psychological damage to the enemy, the hesitation that spread through even the most hardened SS troops? Paperwork could never capture it all. In addition to the Medal of Honor, Currey received other awards like the Silver Star for gallantry, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts for wounds suffered in battle. Belgium awarded him the Order of Leopold because his stand had been instrumental in saving their towns from destruction. Even General Eisenhower himself, as later reports state, told Currey that his actions had cut the war by 6 weeks. Whether precise or not, the tone was clear. His stand made a difference. And for Currey, probably not. He accepted the medals with the same quiet grace his men had perceived on the battlefield, not willing to articulate vainglory in any way. No victory speech, nowhere soaking in accolades. Later, when asked about receiving the Medal of Honor, Currey would just shrug, "I just did my job." In interviews conducted decades later, Currey's tone remained flat, almost incredulous that anyone would want to call him a hero. That humility became part of the story. For many veterans, recognition meant parades, memoirs, and lifelong celebrity. Currey wanted none of it. After the war, he returned to New York, worked in veterans' services, ran small businesses, and lived an ordinary life. The man who had fought like an entire squad was content to blend back into the crowd. Other people could not downplay the actions. His deeds were analyzed and scrutinized by military historians. Training manuals cited his actions as an example of initiative and adaptability under fire. And younger soldiers read the citation, trying to imagine what it was like for a 19-year-old to improvise with such lethal effect. The medal told one story. Currey's shrug told another. For him, there was no mystery. He simply held the bridge because it needed holding. Clearly, the question remained for everyone else. How could one quiet kid from New York manage what entire platoons could not do? For all the ribbons and honors, it wasn't paper that revealed the deeper truth. It was an image buried in an archive. The photograph that breathes. For years, Francis Sherman Currey's story lived mostly in words. His Medal of Honor citation, his comrades' recollections, and the quiet acknowledgement from military historians who studied the Battle of the Bulge. But 80 years after his stand at Malmedy, a different kind of evidence surfaced, one that made experts stop mid-sentence. It wasn't another diary entry or after-action report. It was a photograph. The image, long buried in an archive, showed Currey standing alongside a group of fellow soldiers in Belgium. Snow blanketed the ground, their uniforms heavy with frost. rifles slung casually as if war were just another day. At first glance, it was one of countless World War II snapshots. Young men, weary yet defiant, frozen in time. But when specialists began zooming in, the mood shifted. Currey wasn't centered. He wasn't even posing in the way others were. He stood slightly apart, his gaze angled, his hands set in a way that spoke less of camaraderie and more of readiness. While the men around him looked like kids exhausted by war, Currey looked carved from it. His eyes carried something most 19-year-olds never should have seen, let alone survived. Military analysts, accustomed to studying posture and battlefield behavior, noticed it immediately. One former officer put it bluntly, "That's not a kid at ease. That's someone who hasn't left the fight." Even while the camera clicked, they pointed to details: the grip of his fingers, the stiff alignment of his shoulders, the quiet awareness in his expression. This wasn't bravado. It was vigilance, the kind of hyper-attunement that soldiers develop when survival has been boiled down to seconds and angles. Then came the deeper realization. The photograph was not merely a snapshot of soldiers. It was a living document of the single moment when one man bore the weight of an army. When zoomed in closer, Currey's boots were still crusted with snow and mud, and his jacket was worn rougher than the others, as if he had spent more time crawling through debris than standing. And behind the commonplace framework of a group photograph, there lingered the impression that this was not all just remembrance. This was proof. To historians, the photo correlated with testimonies on both sides of the conflict. The German post-war accounts spoke of confronting what was regarded as an orchestrated American defense, perhaps the illusion of a host of anti-tank teams, maybe the fear of hidden reinforcements. In truth, it had been Currey all along, effortlessly transitioning from role to role, so much so that even 80 years later, the camera seemed almost to suspect that a second man was in the frame. Stare long enough, and some swore they could see it, a faint suggestion that he filled the space with more presence than his single body was able to. Some experts turned pale over a study of the face. It was not out of superstition, it was out of recognition. It was a photo of someone who had changed the rhythm of battle, who had held back a tide that should have drowned him. The more they looked, the more unpleasant it turned. It wasn't just the triumphant grin of a war hero posing for posterity. It was the unshakable calm of a 19-year-old who had already faced death and forced it to step back. Only that, it would breathe, not static, carrying tension and defiance and all kinds of weight by a stand against logic. 80 years later, even on paper, Currey still looked like the one soldier who had to create an army out of one. And as the experts admitted, the photograph didn't just preserve the past. It made them reconsider what the Germans had seen that day, and why it had been enough to make them stop. Why experts turned pale. At first, the photograph of Francis Sherman Currey seemed ordinary, another World War II snapshot of young men standing in the snow, rifles slung, faces marked by exhaustion. But when historians and analysts zoomed in, unease spread. This wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was a portrait of a 19-year-old who had fought like a phantom, and somehow the camera had captured it. The differences were subtle, yet undeniable. The others slouched, their bodies sagging under days of cold and fatigue. Currey stood braced, almost as if the battle had not paused even for the shudder. Then his eyes, steady, alert, watchful. They carried the same unnerving calm that had once made German tank crews hesitate. One analyst whispered, it looked as though Currey was still scanning for targets, even 80 years later. This detail aligned with a question that haunted after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge. Why did hardened Waffen-SS troops, notorious for ruthlessness, pull back from a position guarded by a lone private? The photograph suggested the answer. Currey radiated inevitability. He didn't look like a frightened teenager. He looked like someone who would never yield. Military psychologists later described this as dominance presence, the intangible aura of a fighter who projects certainty, even under impossible odds. Most soldiers reveal relief or strain once the danger passes. Currey's expression was different. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't exhaustion, it was composure, the kind that makes opponents believe they're walking into a trap. As one historian put it, the Germans weren't staring at a boy with a bazooka, they were staring at inevitability, and inevitability makes you hesitate. That understanding explained things in the reaction in the archive room. The experts weren't arguing about a photographic image. They were dealing with the evidence that a man had bent reality on the battlefield, creating an illusion of a larger force that never existed. The illusion had remained. Currey still seemed decades later to have carried along with him the presence of an entire unit. The longer they studied it, the worse it got. The photo should not breathe, but this one felt very much alive. The same fear and doubt that had coursed through German soldiers in 1944 seemed to ripple across the ages. In those watchful eyes, the experts saw why that armored spearhead had stalled at a Belgian bridge. Not medals, not speeches, not lesser honors were the things that rendered the photograph chilling. Rather, it was a reminder that, on this day, one little boy, tending 19, forced seasoned SS troops to retreat, not by numbers, but by will. The camera click was frozen in this very moment, and so was this force. That was when silence descended upon the room. The experts went pale. They were not merely staring in awe of a hero from the past. Currey didn't ask to be a symbol, yet the record and the camera won't let him fade. If this deep dive gave you a new way to see a simple World War II photo, like the video, subscribe and drop a comment on which detail hit you hardest. And when you're ready, watch the next video on your screen for another story that hides more than it shows.